Need a lift? He smiles as he winds the window down. It's not surprising. She must look a proper sight, drenched in her mauve anorak, and he has no idea what she's learned about him. She doesn't plan on getting into the car with the suspected murderer, but the rain is bucketing down and her bus won't arrive for another 20 minutes, so she accepts his offer. They don't chat much as he drives back towards Partridge Mews. He makes a few choice remarks about the weather. It's so cold that each word is accompanied by a small puff of steam. He hunkers down and peers through the windscreen as he navigates the winding country roads. All of this should have been enough for her to realise that it isn't the right time to accuse someone of murder. But she's always had a flair for the dramatic. She gets it from her mother. She can't quell her rising nausea and grips her knees tightly as her mind spins through all she's recently learned. Before she can stop herself, she says, "You killed her, didn't you?" Silence, except for the rain battering the car. He remains impassive, stares directly into the dark ahead of them. She looks across at him to see his jaw twitch. With no light about them, their skin has a ghostly pallor, and she gulps because if she's proven right, then she might end up becoming a phantom. As she edges her left hand towards the door handle, he finally says, "You have no idea what you're talking about." There's a grit to his tone, a tight anger wrapped around his Adam's apple. "I don't know everything that happened, but I know you." "Really? You know me and think I could have done it?" "Yes, because she was planning to leave and you're a control freak." "Who said she was planning to leave?" If she tells him, perhaps he'll reveal everything he's done. However, he might go after the others, and she doesn't want any more deaths on her conscience. "That's none of your business," she says. "Just hand yourself over to the police and accept the consequences." She doesn't anticipate the blow, the great weight of his arm slamming against her chest. The car zigzags down the road as he whacks her repeatedly. He yells, but the words are incoherent and she can do nothing to shield herself. She grabs his arm, forces it back towards the steering wheel, implores him to keep an eye on the road. He continues to hit her. She accepts each blow against her upper body, the sound almost in time with the downpour. Focusing on her breathing, she looks around the car just as she's seen in the films. He doesn't notice her undo his seatbelt, even as it springs back over his body. His assault continues, but she doesn't succumb to the pain. Not yet. She grits her teeth as dull aches bloom across her chest. She takes hold of his arm again, if only to see the road, but all she sees is the onslaught of rain. She steels herself. She pushes his arm away from her and wrenches the handbrake up with all her force. The car spins. The world is a blur. It's like being trapped in a kaleidoscope. Tires screech and metal crunches. Then there's a slam and the sound of shattering glass. His bellowing will haunt her nightmares. The sight of him hurtling through the windscreen will never fade from her memory, and, as she loses consciousness, she knows that the dull thud and crunch as he collides with a tree will be the soundtrack to the rest of her days. And that is the prelude to my second cozy crime novel, Mistakes Mean Murder, which also happens to be the second book to feature Alice Valentine and Marmaduke Featherstone. In this book, 3 women, all named Gloria Hebblethwaite, are said to have died on the same day. 2 of them look like murder, and 1 of them cannot be found. When Alice and Duke begin their investigation into this, they end up embroiled in a family feud that has been brewing for decades. We find out secrets about people from Partridge Mews who we have met in the past and perhaps did not know that they had this history. While this is all happening, Marmaduke is investigating poison pen letters that have been sent to the committee of the local WI. Yes, this means that we are linking a bit to characters we have met before in the Ardora series, but know that there is a point to it all, and at the end of it, we are going to find out more about the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Duke's niece, Joanna, and why she might have gone missing in the first place. Today, the 12th of February 2025, marks 5 years since the first book in the series, An Heir to Murder, came out. And I have talked a lot about how I did not want it to be so long between these two books, especially considering I finished the first draft of An Heir to Murder back in 2018. Things just work out differently than we can expect. I wrote and released Doris Ahoy in 2019, and I had been holding on to this book, and I wanted to release An Heir to Murder in 2020 rather than hold on to it until I'd finished the Doris series, because I could see links between An Heir to Murder and Royally Doris and the way that both series might go, and also didn't want things that might be said in Royally Doris to have a long payoff, or maybe we would find stuff out in An Heir to Murder that might influence that. And so over time, the series and the writing of them, the last book and then this series as well, became intermingled a bit. But Mistakes Mean Murder is an idea I had many, many years ago. I was thinking about how Agatha Christie named books after nursery rhymes, and I was also thinking about fairy tale retellings. I believe I'd read a crime novel that had mentioned some fairy tale at the time. Whatever it was, I was in my car driving home from work, and I remember thinking about Red Riding Hood. And back then, when I came up with this plot, there was going to be this mix-up of somebody had found their long-lost grandmother. Said grandmother ended up dead. This person came back to Partridge Mews and made this announcement. And when they made this announcement, the actual person showed up at the door saying, "I'm not dead and I don't know who this person is." That's not what happened here. I have talked quite often about how this book became the most difficult book I've written, despite the fact that it's about the same size as An Heir to Murder. And I think that that was because of what I was trying to do. I always like to try and challenge myself with each subsequent book. And with Mistakes Mean Murder, I was very aware that it'd been quite a long time since I had written An Heir to Murder, and I was trying to capture the style of writing that I had there, and I couldn't do it. There was something rather pithy and quippy about the first book. I managed to use the humour from our Doris, written in the third person, and avoid falling too much into Harold's voice. But with Mistakes Mean Murder, the tone has changed somewhat. There is definitely something a bit darker about this book and about the tone and the style of writing. I have been told that what readers have appreciated about Mistakes Mean Murder is that while the humour is there, it no longer feels like it's detracting from a scene, and that if a scene needs to be tense, I haven't injected any humour in there that might have felt a bit unnecessary. And there is a reason behind that. It's basically life. So this has also been a book that's been written during a rather troublesome time within my family. I announced Mistakes Mean Murder during a live stream with Charlie back when we'd read An Heir to Murder as a group. So that will be in 2023, nearly 2 years ago. And I anticipated the book coming out in September that year. I had this great idea in my head that at the pace I was writing, I could have the book finished within a month and then get beta readers to read it, have Dane come in and edit the book and bring it out. But unfortunately, life doesn't work that way. And in 2022, due to something that was going on at the charity shop, I had a lot of overtime, which meant that I didn't get the chance to work on the book as much as I wanted to. And then certain events happened within my family that meant I could not write about murder. There was absolutely no way I could do it. It was a topic that seemed rather crass and awful for me to be writing about, given certain things that were happening in my family. And as I say, this isn't something that I'm going to talk about publicly because one, it's not my story to tell, and I was really on the outside of certain events, but the darkness from all of that meant that I just could not bring myself to write this book. It's a funny thing that happened with An Heir to Murder as well. Before I ended up finishing An Heir to Murder, my grandmother died and her name was Alice, and so it was a difficult one to write then. I stopped writing this book for around 3 months, if not longer, given certain events. And that's not what a person wants to do. I will say that writing did happen during that time, but unfortunately it wasn't on this book. But then what happened was that the time away had me examining this book again. There has been another difficulty with this book in that with An Heir to Murder, I knew from the off who the murderer was. I knew my culprit. I knew the story. This helped because I'd originally had the idea when I was 12, and so it had percolated in my mind for a really long time. Whereas with this, all I'd had was this idea of Red Riding Hood, and as I wrote more, the book changed, and I was trying to stop the story from getting convoluted, and then it would get more convoluted, and the more I tried to stop it being convoluted, the more convoluted it got. So that I was incredibly confused during the writing of this. Even my readers were, and we worked hard to get some clarity in there so everyone could understand who was who, which amounts to some repetition in there and certain things, but hopefully by the end of it, it will all make sense to the reader, because myself and the beta readers and the editors, well, the editor worked hard to make sure that it made sense. I think as well with this one, I added the difficulty in of doing the two perspectives of having Alice in there and then having Duke there, and I wrote all of Alice's story first, but then I had to go back and write Duke's story, and trying to figure out where Duke's story was going to fit in, as well as having in scenes with Alice, was a bit of a weird one. And also, I mean, I like doing that because it gave us a different sense of people's relationships and people's character within the book, and when you read it, it will make sense to you what I'm saying. But Duke was supposed to have his own perspective and his own chapters in the first book, but it never happened. Yet here it felt important. It felt like Duke definitely wanted his story to be told in Mistakes Me and Murder as much as he wanted it, as much as he ignored and avoided telling it to me in An Heir to Murder. He was all for telling it here. And he's definitely ready to tell a story in the third book if he can just wait for me to write a charity shop novel first. I also had a thing where I moved a huge pivotal scene from the middle of this book. I introduced new characters and I was trying to give them a sense of character as well. I had a lot to do with this book, and I hope that I actually managed to achieve it. I'm hoping that when people read this book, they don't begin to question anything more about my writing and the way I go about things. I do have a series of 5 books planned so far. I originally planned 10, but then I moved the one mystery down to 5 books. So I still have all the subsequent books, should I choose to write them, there. There will be a complete story arc told within those 5 books, and I don't know whether I'll do it as a full series then, where a different book gives more of a story about what went on, or whether it will just be standalone crime novels that follow on from each other. One thing that I always remember when it comes to An Heir to Murder is Brian of Bookish, who helped me with Mistakes Me and Murder and beta read it and did a brilliant job. I couldn't have asked for a better group of beta readers than I had for Mistakes Me and Murder. Brian definitely had a great eye for helping me, and I am grateful for that immensely. But in his original review, he talked about what he liked was that Alice didn't care in the first book about her waistline, and Alice didn't care about men. She didn't have a boyfriend throughout this book. And one of her main challenges in Mistakes Me and Murder is a man who might have not been the nicest to her. So I'm just going to read a few pages here from chapter 1, which is our first meeting with Alice in Mistakes Me and Murder, and I think is a good reintroduction to her character. It's been about 18 months since we last met her in Storyland, whereas it's been 5 years for a lot of people. Chapter 1. Alice met him at a bar because she thought that a neutral location would be best. It also denied him the opportunity to cry. She didn't have a problem with men crying. She welcomed any man in touch with his emotions. But this particular specimen had more crocodile tears than a swamp. If Alice wanted to argue, he cried. If she wanted to watch something other than Top Gear, he cried. There was even that night when they'd gone to a restaurant for her birthday, and when it came to paying, he had misplaced his wallet. Granted, he'd waited until they were back at her cottage before unleashing a torrent of half-hearted sobs and drunken wailing in which he declared his apologies and called himself awful. Then he disappeared for a few months with no contact, not even a bum dial, before texting her out of the blue with a request to meet him. Alice had considered not responding, but she'd left a pair of Carvalho heels on his narrowboat that she could do with getting back, and so she'd agreed to the meeting, if only to retrieve her shoes and break up with him good and proper. With him sitting across from her looking sheepish, Alice wondered if she'd made the right decision. He rubbed his hands down his jeans, emitted a sigh that was somewhere between a yowl and a yawn before saying, "You're never gonna believe this. That you're late, because that's very easy to believe considering it's one of your habits." "Am I?" He made an exaggerated effort of taking his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen and staring down in feigned shock at the time. "I don't know how that happened. No, what I was going to say is that I've forgotten my wallet." Alice glugged her Pinot Grigio. "Did you bring my shoes?" When she asked the question, Ryan looked down at his trainers, scraping the sole of the scuffed Nike Air Maxes against the hardwood floor. Eventually he said, "They fell off the boat." Alice gripped her wine glass. "How does a pair of shoes just fall off a boat?" "I dropped them." "You dropped my shoes off your boat?" Alice's eyes went so wide that she resembled a lemur with a thermometer up its backside. She groaned and fell back against her seat. "This might be the worst thing a man has ever done to me." "Didn't a man once hold you at gunpoint?" "Yes, but he was a murderer," Alice said, glancing down at her wine. "That's the sort of behaviour you can expect." That is our first reintroduction to Alice and Ryan, who is going to become a bit of a thorn in her side within Mistakes Mean Murder. It also goes on to kind of examine who she is within a relationship. We also look at how people feel about her being a bit more angry and obstreperous with folk, a bit more sarky. I'd say that this one's a bit more developed because the characters all know each other now, and I know the characters and I can see how they play with one another. I mean, I do a lot of work before writing any characters to see how they're going to work together. It's one of the things that I like doing, and there are reams and reams of pages of dialogue where it's just me putting the characters together and seeing how they converse. It's one of the whole reasons that Primrose ended up getting more time in An Heir to Murder, Alice's mother, because she was a character I'd never written before. Most of my characters have always been a bit more sarky or jokey, or they get into this aggressive mode. And Primrose just looks at everything with rose-tinted glasses, and she always has to have a bright spin on things. Indeed, when I've been writing her in the past, I've had to say things and then change them. You're like, that's not the way she'd say it. She's never going to be mean. And there's quite a few pivotal scenes within Mistakes Mean Murder that I quite like for Primrose being there because of the way that Primrose interacts with people as opposed to the way that Alice interacts with people, and we get to see that interplay more and the way that they're different from one another. Yeah, that's something that I've liked about this book, is it seems to examine the relationships between daughters and mothers and female friendship a bit more than I think I've looked at in any of my other books. It's something that happened naturally. I hadn't gone into the book with this intention to do that. But then once I noticed that there was a lot about Alice and Primrose in here, and then I noticed stuff between a specific character and another specific character, and then other stuff happened, I was like, there's a lot going on here about mothers, and actually the way one story, there's a history we hear about one character in this book. Sorry, I'm being very non-spoilery and trying not to, just teasing everyone here. But there is a story about one character and who they are that we learn in this book that inspired the ending of the book and the final scene before we get to a bit of an epilogue. That was all thanks to this notion of me recognising a theme there. We also see Alice trying to develop some female friends, because that was one of the issues that I had with the first book, was that Alice had a lack of anyone but her mother to speak to. Again, this was simply because I felt like there were so many characters in An Heir to Murder already that I didn't want to introduce another one. Otherwise, a character that we meet at the end of chapter 1 who goes on to become a bit more important of creating a relationship with another woman for Alice. She was supposed to be in the first book, and I had written scenes of Alice and this character chatting to each other before and working together before, but Primrose almost took on the role that this character had in the first book, but it was important for me to introduce them in this second book, ready for things that are going to happen in the later books. I was really just glad of that character, and I hope that other people enjoy meeting said character as well. Anyway, I think that's enough of an introduction into Mistakes Mean Murder. It's been a long time coming, and I had planned on just sharing those first 2 scenes and a bit of the history behind how this book came to be. As I say, it is the most difficult, the most challenging book I've ever written. It is the book that I have rewritten more than any of my books before. This is the only book in which every single character at one point was a suspect, and I actually wrote several plans for this book which would detail how a different person would be the culprit. If you go into this book and you're thinking you're going down one route and it turns out that the culprit isn't who you thought it was, just know. I did exactly the same thing whilst writing this book. I thought I was going down one route and I didn't. Indeed, certain characters ended up getting cut out of this book simply because they no longer worked, because I had them pegged as a culprit in the beginning, but now they only appeared in a tiny scene and it no longer worked for them to exist. So I'm sorry to specific characters in here that went missing, but I hope that I came up with a fitting end to the second book, and I've just got to plan and write the third one. And I'll say I do have a title for that, but I'm not sharing it, because as with this book, it could change. Anyway, Mistakes Mean Murder is now available. I hope that you get it, you read it, enjoy it. Please support your local writer, well, your indie writer. I'm probably not local to you. You could be watching this anywhere. You could be watching this in, like, I don't know, Otterburn, maybe. For now, I'm going to say thank you to everyone who has already supported this book. Thank you to everyone who has watched this video and might go out and acquire a copy of Mistakes Mean Murder now. I hope that you enjoyed this video, because until next time, that is all.